So there is no hard and fast rule that it shouldn't include monetary deprivation also. But it's essentially a measure to track this deprivation in a standardized and comparable manner. The idea is that if you have this index, you're going to be able to look at trends in different regions, trends over time, which you will not be able to do it if you have it as just a concept, right? So that's the idea behind this. Now, there are different types of indices. So some of the different types of indices, you've got economic and welfare indices, right? You've got so things like ease of doing business or human development index. All of that will come into that category, right? So over there you're measuring progress in well-being or welfare of people, right? Either in economic terms or in non-economic terms like the HDI. The second is inequality indices, right? So something like the Gini coefficient, where you're trying to understand what is the spread of the population. And then the third kind of index is something like something called base of pyramid index, BOP indices, right? So this comes into the third category, where you're looking at the lowest of the low population and you're trying to understand what the situation is like within the base of the pyramid and not the rest of it. So you can use most indices actually fall in, they're not very clean-cut definitions, distinctions between all of them, because all of them traditionally tend to look at elements of all of these three different types of indices. But in theory, these are some of the different types of indices that we have. Now, I told you that in 2010, the UNDP in its Human Development Report launched the first multidimensional poverty index, and since then, the multidimensional poverty index is a publication that's launched every year by the UNDP anyway, like as a separate report. How does the UNDP measure multidimensional poverty, right? So these are the three dimensions that they have within it, right? So they have health, they have education, and they have standard of living. They don't have monetary poverty as part or monetary deprivation as part of this. So there is no measure of income. Now the reason for this is because the UNDP, as I said, it looks at it as a complement. So there is supposed to be an add-on measure to understand poverty and not supposed to replace traditional poverty measure. So under health, so the three things that you see on top, health, education, and standard of living, these are your dimensions, right? Within the dimensions, you have indicators. So these indicators are not, so within health, they have nutrition and they have child mortality. Within education, they have years of schooling and school attendance. And in standard of living, they have fuel, sanitation, clean water, electricity, housing, and assets. When they're talking about assets, they're not talking about assets purely in the way that we understand it in financial terms. They're talking about assets in a very different sense. So in the social sense, that when you talk about assets, you're also talking about things like mobile phones, TVs, cars. So it's not the appreciating asset that we generally think of in financial terms, right? So in the UNDP, what they've done is they measure deprivation. So for each of these indicators, you will have something called cutoffs, right? So there will be a statement. So nutrition could, so years of schooling, for example, could be that we will have, if the household should have a member who has completed 6 years of schooling. If they have that member, they are considered not deprived. If they don't have that member, then they are considered deprived in that particular indicator. Now, what is in the UNDP measure? All of these are equal in the sense that health, education, standard of living are weighted equally. So this has 1/3 of the weight, this has 1/3 of the weight, that has 1/3 of the weight, and then under that you have each of these which have a different weightage, right? So you got this has 1/6, 1/6, 1/6, 1/6, and then it totals up. So the idea is that across all the three, the weights total up to 1, so that you're able to calculate more easily. So technically, nutrition, child mortality, years of schooling, and school attendance, right? So the weights for these outweigh the weights for this, right? So even if, like, let's say for instance that someone does well on all of that, but if they're poor on this, then this outweighs that. You will still have someone who's probably going to fall below the cutoff rate. So this is in the UNDP case. The important thing to note here is that we'll go into the weights and why they're important a little bit later. But the important thing to understand here is that it's equally weighted. That all of these dimensions have equal weights within their, all of these indicators have equal weights over there within their larger dimensions.
Just one question. You mentioned 1/6. Each of them have got the weightage of 1/6. 1/6 of what? I mean, each of the 1/6 of this side?
Sorry?
You mentioned 1/6. Each of them have got the
No,
weightage.
not all of them is 1/6. So all of these three dimensions are 1/3.
Correct.
Right? So this contributes 1/3 to the contributes one third, this contributes one third. So under that they're equally weighted. So 1616, 1616, and 1 by 7, 1 by 7, 1 by 7, so on. So nutrition contributes 1/6 to health, child mortality contributes 1/6 to health.
Acha, as a whole.
Yeah.
Just to consider health.
Yeah.
Okay, got it.
And then health contributes 1/3 to MPI. And when we go into the calculation of the MPI, this will become a lot clearer, right? Why the weights are important. But that is the idea. So we are basically saying that health, education, and living are 3 dimensions, and each of them are equally important. That's essentially the statement that's being made over here.
There is no income factor anywhere.
Not within the UNDP's measure. Because the UNDP looks at the MPI as a complement to traditional poverty measurement. So they say that we are going to look at the MPI, we are going to look at deprivations in a non-monetary sense, and we are going to use that in tandem with the deprivations that you face in income. So that's a separate measure, and this is a separate measure. And that's why, if you saw the slide earlier, there was that overlap graph that I given. That's why we're able to look at that, because seeing that that is one measure, so that straight line that we saw over there is one measure, and the bars are also one measure. If you look at the World Bank, though, the monetary part of it comes in. So World Bank has changed the methodology slightly. They still use the AF methodology, the Alkaya-Foster methodology, but if you look at the dimensions, the way that they distributed it is very different. So they again have equal weightage to all the dimensions. So one third. But instead of health, they've got monetary standard of income. And under that, they've got consumption of income, which is nothing but your unidimensional poverty measurement. They've combined that with education. So again, you've got 1616 for education attainment and enrollment, and then you've got 1/3 each for drinking water, sanitation, electricity. So the World Bank measure is quite different from the UNDP measure, and this they use the $190, the $90 a day measure. So anyone who's falling below that $190 will automatically be deprived in the first indicator.
But the unit of measure might be in terms of machinery or the household level.
Yeah. So the unit of data collection is at the individual level, but the indicators are at the household level. Yeah. So the unit of analysis is the household level.
So, say for example, some of the indicators that the UNDP how does that come from
So you'll see that when you come to the indicators. So the indicators are termed in a way, the cutoff for the indicators are termed in a way that they act at the household level. So they'll say that if the household doesn't have a member who has minimum 6 years of schooling, or if the household has a member who is above the age of 10 but is not attending school until class 8, right? So the moment that cutoff is not met, immediately that person, that household gets tagged as a deprived household. So in child mortality, for example, the deprivation cutoff is something like in the last 5 years, if you had a child below the age of 5 in the household pass away. So the data is collected from an individual, but it represents, the indicators are termed in such a way that they represent the household. So we'll come to the cutoffs in a minute. Over there you'll see how the cutoffs are termed. So India's MPI, how did we get to finally using the concept of an MPI and coming up with a national measure? So the Niti Aayog is the one that has been tasked with developing the MPI. So within the Niti Aayog there is a department, the Development Monitoring and Evaluation Office, which is tasked with earlier just monitoring and evaluation, but now they're also tasked with something called the Global Indices for Reforms and Growth. Now the GIRG project is essentially this Government of India project where we're trying to look at a selection of 31 indicators, global indicators. So things like the ease of doing business, things like the Gini index, things like the Human Development Index, all of that, across 4 different categories: industry, development, economy, and governance. So their aim to GIRG is to improve our ranking to measure and improve our ranking on these 31 indices. So along with that, one of the indices that has been selected within the GIRG is the MPI, which is why the Government of India has launched its own MPI measure to basically calculate based on this global standard and to improve our ranking on the overall global index. So what are the steps? How do we calculate you'll actually have only step 1 and step 2, so identification and aggregation. So what you see under step 0 is my addition. So the preparation step is something that I've added on. If you read the report, the steps that are given under preparation actually come under the identification stage. So in step 0, what do we do? Right? So we determine the dimensions and indicators. Right? So we give the conceptual shape. What is the conceptual framework that is going to guide our multi-dimensional poverty index? So we define, okay, these are the 3 or 4 or 5 or 6, whatever number of different dimensions that we're going to look at. These are the indicators that we're going to look at. The second thing that we do is we set the cutoffs that I was talking about, right? So how do you calculate whether a person or household is deprived in a particular indicator? So you set those cutoffs. So once you've got the deprivation, you've got the dimensions, you've got the indicators, the third thing that you do is you set the cutoffs. And then you set the weights, right? So this is the conceptual framework for your MPM. And that's the reason why I separated it, unlike how it's given in the report. That's why I've separated it and put it as a separate step. Because until you do this, you can't get to the data collection, identification, and analysis stage. Right? So this is the conceptual framework for the Indian MPI. Is it visible to everyone in the back? You can see it. So, just like the UNDP measure, we've taken the same 3 dimensions and we've given them equal weightage, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. There is one crucial difference between the Indian measure and the UNDP measure. So we added on additionally from child, in addition to child and adolescent mortality, we also added on antenatal care. The reason for this is because in India, the government has been focusing on ensuring that every mother has access to 4 antenatal care visits because that, data has shown that really improves both maternal and child mortality outcomes. So because we are in a developing country state and that's something that the government is focusing on to ensure that maternal care is better, that's something that they added on to the index itself. And to make sure that that these don't sort of methodologically, we need to make sure that child and adolescent mortality and antenatal care don't undermine nutrition, right? Because you could have a situation where there's a household that hasn't had kids, right? So there they will automatically be not deprived with child and adolescent mortality and antenatal care, right? So if you had an equal weight of 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 for each of them, that household, because it does well over here, even if it's doing badly on nutrition, would automatically way better than a household that has been deprived with the other 2 indicators, right? So hence, the idea was that they would give 1/6 of the weight in nutrition so that it is heavily weighted, and then 1/12 to these 2 indicators, so that weighting doesn't affect the outcomes on the index. So what are the indicators that we have? So we got the dimensions here, we got the weights. What are the indicators? Nutrition, child and adolescent mortality, antenatal care, years of schooling, school attendance, cooking fuel, sanitation, drinking water, electricity, housing, assets, and we've got one more additional one in the Indian one, which is bank account. Whether or not a citizen has access to a bank account or not, because that's something that we have where there is a unique problem. It's been stymied to some degree through Jan Dhan, but there is still a significant population that doesn't have financial capability purely because they don't have a bank account. Right? So when you look at the cutoffs at each of these, for each of these, you'll see what I was talking about earlier. So once you've done that, once you've set up this conceptual framework, once that shell is created, then you start doing the identification, right? So there you'll start doing the data collection. After you've done the data collection and put it all there and sort of map all the data, the first thing that you're going to do is apply the first cutoff. So now the Alkire-Foster methodology is brilliant because of one methodological evolution that it has done on the unidimensional poverty measurement. It has something called a dual cutoff approach. So there is one cutoff, and don't worry if you don't understand it right now, I'm just sort of giving you an idea, it's something that we will address later. So it has one cutoff at the indicator level. So a household is deprived or not deprived if it meets that cutoff, right? And then it has one cutoff at the across indicators. So once you calculate it, you apply the weights, you sum up the deprivations, you come up with a score. Now whether a household is multidimensionally poor or not, you will decide based on that score and a cutoff that's given in that score. So there are 2 sets of cutoffs. So you apply the first cutoff the first cutoff, that is for the indicator. And you will check whether an individual is deprived in any one indicator, right? So first you will do it for health, you'll do it for nutrition, then you'll do it for childhood births and mortality, you'll keep doing it, and then you'll do it for all of the different indicators that are there. Then you calculate the weighted sum of deprivations. So you will multiply basically the score that an individual has with the weight. And then you come up with the sum. That will give you the deprivation score. And then you apply the second cutoff. So this is the methodology that you have for doing this. How do we do this? Something that we get into. So what is the dual cutoff and why is it necessary? Should a person be considered multidimensionally poor? This is again a difficult and philosophical question, something that there isn't a real clear answer to, but something that the AF methodology tries to give us an answer. Should a person be considered deprived or multidimensionally poor if they are deprived in any one dimension? So if they are deprived in health, automatically they are multidimensionally poor? Or should they be considered multidimensionally poor only if they are deprived in all three dimensions? What do you think of it? One? If they are deprived in any one indicator, then they should be considered multidimensional poor. That's what you're saying. Right?
If it is only one, it will become unidimensional.
No, you're still collecting the data across three dimensions. But what you're saying is that if we are going to look at only one dimension to consider, so even if let's say someone is deprived in education, it doesn't matter if they've got good outcomes on health and nutrition, automatically they're multidimensional. That's what you're saying. You're still calculating for all three dimensions. So this is a big question that people face for the longest time, and this is what the AF methodology tries to answer, because there is no clear answer to this. Because what will happen if you look at this is that if you consider a household that is deprived in any one of the dimensions as being deprived, you will have something called, this is called the union approach.
What is union?
Sorry? Alkier-Foster. Alkier-Foster. The Alkier-Foster methodology. So Sabina Alkier and James Foster are the people who developed the methodology. It's named after them.
Those two.
Yeah.
I would suggest it should be like out of three, it should be on an average.
Yeah, that's something close to what the Alkier-Foster methodology does.
I think that is the
That's
way-
why that second cutoff is there. Because the problem with the union approach is that you have severe overcount, right? If you were to look at any person who's deprived in any one of the dimensions as being multidimensionally poor, the population of multidimensional poor population that you have is huge, right? If you look at the intersection approach though, it's undercounting. So someone who is significantly deprived on two indicators, just because they're not deprived in say infrastructure, will not be counted as multidimensionally poor. So there are problems with both, and this is something that policymakers grappled with for quite some time, from between the 1990s and the 2000s, before the AF methodology came in. So how does the AF methodology try to address this? So it doesn't use an average per se, but there is a methodological thing that it uses. So that is the first order cutoff and the second order cutoff, right? So the first order cutoff, which is within indicators, which basically says that okay, you are multidimensionally poor in this indicator if you need this. If you don't need this, right? So that's what I was talking about the nutrition or about child mortality. So if you are in a household that has seen one death of a child below the age of 5, then you are automatically deprived. So that is your first order cutoff, right? Or if you are in a household where there is a child above the age of 10 who has not been going to school, who is not attending school, then automatically you are deprived of that indicator. So that's your first order cutoff, right? That is for one indicator. The second order cutoff is across indicators and dimensions, right? So that is what I was talking about, where you tally all of the different deprivations that a person has on each of the indicators, you add up the score, and then you have a second order cutoff. So a person whose score is below that cutoff is considered multidimensionally poor. It's a very simple innovation, but this took the better part of 10 years to come up with, because it was something that was empirically done for quite a while. I mean, now that you look at it in hindsight, it seems kind of counterintuitive. It seems very intuitive. Why wouldn't you just do this? But in practice, it was a lot harder for them to come up with the concept. And this is the innovation that the AF methodology brought in. So the AF methodology is now something that's used for a host of other things. Like I said, it's something that's used for GNH. So if you look at the way that GNH, gross national happiness, is calculated, it's very similar. So they have different dimensions, and then they have indicators in each of those dimensions. apply second order cutoff. So this is now been used, this methodology can be used and appropriated for a bunch of other uses as well. It's not only for the calculation of multi-dimensional property. This should answer your question about the cutoffs, the indicators. So what are the first order cutoffs and what do they look like, right? So I've taken the example of education. So education has 1/3 to weight. It has two indicators, each of them with 1/6 to weight, right? So in the first one, the cutoff is that household will be considered deprived if not even one member of the household who is aged 10 years or older has completed 6 years of schooling, right? So any household that has any member who has not completed, if any household has a situation where none of the members of the household has completed 6 years of schooling, automatically they will be considered deprived in that one indicator, right? So that's the cutoff. So you're collecting the data from the individual level, but the data that you get will talk to the household level, right? So it's not related to any one individual. It's related to the household overall. Same thing with school attendance, right? So any school age, the household will be considered deprived if any school age child is not attending school up to the age at which he or she would complete class 8. So if you've got, say, a 13-year-old kid who is not completing education, automatically that household will be considered deprived. It doesn't matter who's answering the question. The mother, the father, the aged old man, anyone can, sort of answer the questionnaire, but you'll get data at the household level. So let's try applying these cutoffs and let's see what will happen. So you've got two households, right? So you've got the first household which has 4 people.
Why cutoff is out of 1 out of 6? The indicators are 2.
Sorry?
Why the cutoff is 1 out of 6? The indicators are only 2.
Because you add up indicators to come up with the dimension, right? So the dimensions are 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, right? So they're equally weighted. In this education dimension, you've got 1/3 and you've got 2 indicators, right? So you will add up 1/6, 1/6 to get 1/3 as the overall weight for that indicator. So if you look at health, that is also 1/6, 1/6. That is 1/6 and 1/12, 1/12. Because that total has to add up to 1/3, right? There are 3 indicators there. If you look at the third thing, which is standard of living, there are 7 indicators there, right? You have 121, 121, 121, 121 weight for each of them, which will totally add up to 1/3 for that dimension. So the reason is because when you're calculating the weights, that the government is basically saying, or the people who are measuring multi-dimensional poverty, they basically by assigning these weights, what they're trying to say is that this is how much this particular indicator contributes to, or this dimension contributes to that person, to that household being multi-dimensionally poor. So they're saying that health, education and standard of living contribute equally. So if a person is deprived in, say, health versus another household that is deprived in education, they both contribute equally, or they're both equally deprived in the larger scheme of things, right? In being multi-dimensionally poor. That's basically what they're trying to say. And the reason why they have to separate that into this thing is because each of these indicators will also contribute to you being deprived in that dimension, right? So they're saying that whether in a household if there is one member who has not completed 6 years of schooling, or you have a household where a school age child is not attending school, both of those contribute equally to deprivation of the household, right? Because if you have a member who has not completed 6 years of schooling, then economic prospects in that household fall significantly in terms of employability and so on, right? And if you don't have a school age child who is going to school, that also contributes because that has an impact on future generations, on future households. So that's why they've basically given these weights and they've said that both of them are equally bad problems, and that's why they have equal weights. Whereas in the case of health, if you look at the all the fraction of the will come to 1. If you calculate all of them, it will come to 1. So, yeah. So 1/6, 1/12, 1/12 contributes to 1/3, right? 1/6, 1/6 contributes to 1/3. 121, 121, so on contributes to 1/3. You total 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 comes to 1. That's the idea. So the reason, they don't necessarily have to give equal weights to all of them. But by giving equal weights, they're basically saying that all of these contribute equally, as in if you're deprived in any one of them, so if you're deprived in sanitation, or if you don't have access to sanitation, it's as bad as you not having access to cooking fuel. If you don't have both, then it's an even bigger problem. That's the idea that they're saying, right? And the reason why something like nutrition, if you look at the grander scheme of things, if you look at nutrition, if a household is fairly badly on nutrition, they're automatically going to get hit by 1/6, right? So you doing badly on this is enough to outweigh well on say 3 of these indicators. So if you've got a child in the house who is malnourished, that is automatically enough to outweigh any benefit that you have in all of these different indicators. So the beauty of it is that you have to look at it completely. And that will give you a clearer picture of what the rationale for it is. And if you actually go to chapter 2 of the MPI report, they've given an explanation as to why that weightage has been given and why they've selected that indicator. How is it relevant in the Indian context? So they've given the research that has gone into why they've selected a particular cutoff. So I think it's a good idea to probably go through that, because that will give you an idea of if they've selected nutrition and the cutoff is that any one person who has a BMI less than this much is going to be considered malnourished. Why have we selected that? What is the implication that has for that household and for being multidimensionally poor? Or if they've selected that a school any person who has not completed 6 years of schooling in the household is going to be considered deprived. Why have they done that? What is the rationale and how does it contribute to poverty there? So this is in chapter 2. You should probably just give that a quick glance because there's a lot of data in it. But that will give you a very clear understanding of what the weights are and why they've been structured that way. So going to this, we spoke about the different cutoffs, right, within education. Now let's take the case of sorry. Yeah. The report is available. I've actually put a link to the report in the document, so I'll share the PPT with you. There's a link for you to access it. So we saw the education cutoffs, right? So let's take these two households, household 1 and household 2, and try to apply those cutoffs and see what will happen. So household 1 has 4 members, household 2 has 3 members. So on the years of schooling in household 1, the father has not completed 6 years of schooling, right? School attendance, the older son is not attending school because the older son is being employed in some activity to contribute to the household. In the second family, the parents have not completed 6 years of schooling, and the 6-year-old daughter is still attending school, right? So how do we score now? So we score in binary, right? We score in 0 and 1. So it's purely yes or no. If a person meets that cutoff, it's 1, so they are deprived. If a person doesn't meet that cutoff, it's 1, they are deprived. If a person meets that cutoff, it's 0, right? So father has not completed 6 years of schooling, right? So they are not deprived of that because the mother has, right? So there is at least one member in the household who has completed 6 years of schooling, hence they are not deprived, hence the score is 0. So given that, can someone guess what the second one will be? What will be the score for the second one? The older son is attending school, and the cutoff is the household will be considered deprived if any school age child is not attending school up to the age at which he or she will complete class 8. Yeah, good point. So let's assume the kid is school age. He is not attending school. So would they be deprived of that indicator or not deprived?
Not deprived.
It doesn't matter. If any school age child is not attending, it doesn't matter what the younger one is doing or not. Even if one of them is not deprived. So what about the next one? Parents have not completed 6 years of schooling. The cutoff is if not even one member of the household aged 10 years or older has completed 6 years.
That would be 1.
And 6-year-old daughter is attending school.
0.
So this is how you score, right? You score in binary. If the household is deprived, you score as 1. If the household is not deprived, you score it as 0. How do we apply this, right? So this is something called vectorization of data. What you're going to say is so we are visualizing the data, right? So when you're doing it, of course, you're going to do it on an Excel sheet, so it's not really going to come to that. But vectorizing is essentially a way that it's a statistics term, the way you basically represent the data in visible form, so that you're able to calculate it or explain it. So these are the different indicators, right? Across all the three dimensions. Here you've got whether a household is deprived or not on this particular thing. So assume that someone has given you this data. You don't have to sit and actually see whether the household is deprived or not. Someone has already seen the cutoff and decided whether they are deprived or not. Right? So in nutrition they are deprived, so hence 1. Right? Child loves it and not, hence 0, and so on. Right? Till the end. Now what you do is you use the weights. This is where the weights come in. Right? So if a person is deprived in nutrition, so you do 1 into 1.6, their score for nutrition becomes 0.16, right? And so on and so forth. So you will do this for the whole thing and you'll come up with something called the deprivation score for that individual or for that household. I mean, you're talking about an individual giving you the data, but the data is being collected for the household, right? So the household's deprivation score is 0.48. So this is how you do it. You apply, first you look at whether the household is deprived or not. According to whether it's deprived or not, you give it a 1-0 binary output. You multiply that output by the weight, and then you sum the weights, the weight score, and then you arrive at a deprivation score, right? So this is you applying the first order cutoff. From here to here, this is the first order cutoff taking place over here, right? The second order cutoff happens at a later stage. So now, what we're going to do is we're going to break qualitative group. This is these are some groups that I've divided based on the appendix that I had, something which help in case any of the groups are undercounted. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you these sheets, right? So each group is going to get these sheets. On these sheets, on the top, you have the data that's been given, right? So you've got each of the indicators, you've got the weights that are given, and you've got whether they're deprived or not deprived. So the first thing that you have to do is, you're going to give the binary output over here. After you give the binary output, you're going to come to this, and you're going to give the weighted scores for that particular thing, and then you're going to arrive at what is the sensor deprivation score. Now what is lucky for you is that each of these states has these 5 Mahashas who decided कि हम अपना खुद का वो state बना रहे हैं, and so luckily for you, you only have to calculate it for 5 households and not for lakhs of population as a whole. So countries are lucky there because maybe I had to do it for like entire states as a whole. So the data has been given to you. All you have to do is then give it the binary output and then give it the weighted output, right? And then arrive at the deprivation score, right? So just break into these groups, divide yourself, and I'll come and distribute these to you. And something will just